Norton Priory is a historic site in Norton, Runcorn, Cheshire, England, comprising the remains of an abbey complex dating from the 12th to 16th centuries, and an 18th-century country house. It is now a museum. The remains are a scheduled ancient monument and are recorded in the National Heritage List for England as a designated Grade I listed building. They are considered to be the most important monastic remains in Cheshire. The priory was established as an Augustinian foundation in the 12th century, and was raised to the status of an abbey in 1391. The abbey was closed in 1536, as part of the dissolution of the monasteries. 9 years later the surviving structures, together with the manor of Norton, were purchased by Sir Richard Brooke, who built a Tudor house on the site, incorporating part of the abbey. This was replaced in the 18th century by a Georgian house. The Brooke family left the house in 1921, and it was partially demolished in 1928. In 1966 the site was given in trust for the use of the general public. Excavation of the site began in 1971, and became the largest to be carried out by modern methods on any European monastic site. It revealed the foundations and lower parts of the walls of the monastery buildings and the abbey church. Important finds included a Norman doorway, a finely carved arcade, a floor of mosaic tiles, the largest floor area of this type to be found in any modern excavation, the remains of the kiln where the tiles were fired, a bell casting pit, used for casting the bell, and a large medieval statue of St. Christopher. The site was opened to the public in the 1970s. It includes a museum, the excavated ruins, and the surrounding garden and woodland. In 1984 the separate walled garden was redesigned and opened to the public. Norton Priory is now a visitor attraction, and the Museum Trust organizes a program of events, exhibitions, educational courses, and outreach projects. History. Priory. In 1115 a community of Augustinian canons was founded in the burgh of Runcorn by William Fitz-Nigel, the second Baron of Halton and Constable of Chester, on the south bank of the River Mersey where it narrows to form the Runcorn Gap. This was the only practical site where the Mersey could be crossed between Warrington and Birkenhead, and the archaeologists Fraser Brown and Christine Howard Davis consider it likely that the canons cared for travellers and pilgrims crossing the river. They also speculate that William may have sought to profit from the tolls paid by these travellers. The priory was the second religious house to be founded in the earldom of Chester. The first was the Benedictine St. Werburgh's Abbey at Chester, founded in 1093 by Hugh Lupus, the first Earl of Chester. The priory at Runcorn had a double dedication, to St. Bertolin and to St. Mary. The authors of the Victoria County history suggest that the dedication to St. Bertolin was taken from a Saxon church already existing on the site. In 1134 William Fitzwilliam, the third Baron of Halton, moved the priory to a site in Norton, a village 3 miles to the east of Runcorn. The reasons for the move are uncertain. It may have been that Fitzwilliam wanted greater control of the strategic crossing of the Mersey at Runcorn Gap, or it may have been because the canons wanted a more secluded site. Nothing remains of the site of the original priory in Runcorn. The site for the new priory was in damp, scrubby woodland. There is no evidence that it was agricultural land, or that it contained any earlier buildings. The first priority was to clear and drain the land. There were freshwater springs near the site, and these would have provided fresh running water for latrines and domestic purposes. They would also have been used to create watercourses and moated enclosures, some of which might have been used for orchards and herb gardens. Sandstone for building the priory was available at an outcrop nearby. Sand for mortar could be obtained from the shores shores of the River Mersey, and boulder clay on the site provided material for floor and roof tiles. Excavation has revealed remnants of oak, some of it from trees hundreds of years old. It is likely that this came from various sources, some from nearby, and some donated from the forests at Delamere and Macclesfield. The church and monastic buildings were constructed in Romanesque style. The priory was endowed by William Fitz-Nigel with properties in Cheshire, Lancashire, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire and Oxfordshire, including the churches of St Mary, Great Budworth and St Michael, Chester. By 1195 the priory owned 8 churches, 5 houses, the tithe of at least 8 mills, the rights of common in 4 townships, and 1/10 of the profits from the Runcorn ferry. The prior supplied the chaplain to the hereditary constables of Chester and to the barons of Halton. During the 12th century, the main benefactors of the priory were the barons of Halton, but after 1200 the gifts reduced, mainly because they transferred their interests to the Cistercian abbey at Stanlow, which had been founded in 1178 by John Fitzrichard, the 6th Baron. Archaeologist J. Patrick Green states that it is unlikely that any of the barons of Halton were buried in Norton Priory. The only members of the family known to be buried there are Richard, brother of Roger de Lacy, the 7th Baron, and a female named Alice. The identity of Alice has not been confirmed, but Green considers that she was the niece of William, Earl Wirren, the 5th Earl of Surrey, and therefore a relative of the de Lacy family, who were at the time the barons of Halton. The Earl made a grant to the priory of 30 shillings a year in order to maintain a pittance for her soul. The role played by the barons of Halton declined, so the importance of members of the Dutton family increased. The Duttons had been benefactors since the priory's foundation, and from the 13th century they became the principal benefactors. There were 2 main branches of the family, one in Dutton and the other in Sutton Weaver. The Dutton family had their own burial chapel in the priory, and burial in the chapel is specified in 3 wills made by members of the family. The Aston family of Aston were also important benefactors. The priory buildings, including the church, were extended during the late 12th and early 13th centuries. It has been estimated that the original community would have consisted of 12 canons and the prior. This increased to around 26 members in the later part of the 12th century, making it one of the largest houses in the Augustinian order. By the end of the century the church had been lengthened, a new and larger chapter house had been built, and a large chapel had been added to the east end of the church. In about 1200 the west front of the church was enlarged, a bell tower was built and guest quarters were constructed. It is possible that the chapel at the east end was built to accommodate the Holy Cross of Norton, a relic which was reputed to have miraculous healing powers. A fire in 1236 destroyed the timber-built kitchen and damaged the west range of the monastic buildings on the roof of the church. The kitchen was rebuilt and the other damage was rapidly repaired. Abbey. During the first half of the 14th century, the priory suffered from financial mismanagement and disputes with the Dutton family, exacerbated by a severe flood in 1331 that reduced the income from the priory's lands. The direct effects of the Black Death are not known, but during the 1350s financial problems continued. These were partly mitigated with the selling of the advowson of the church at Ratcliffe-on-Soar. Matters further improved from 1366 with the appointment of Richard Wyke as prior. He was active in the governance of the wider Augustinian order and in political affairs, and in 1391 was involved in raising the priory's status to that of a mitred abbey. A mitred abbey was one in which the abbot was given permission to use pontifical insignia, including the mitre, ring and pontifical star, and to give the solemn benediction provided a bishop was not present. It was rare for an Augustinian house to be elevated to this status. Out of about 200 Augustinian houses in England and Wales, 28 were abbeys, and only 7 of these became mitred. The only other mitred abbey in Cheshire was that of St Werburgh in Chester. In 1379 and in 1381 there were 15 canons at Norton, and in 1401 there were 16, making it the largest Augustinian community in the northwest of England. By this time the barony of Halton had passed by a series of marriages to the Duchy of Lancaster. John of Gaunt, the first Duke of Lancaster and 14th Baron of Halton, agreed to be the patron of the newly formed abbey. At this date the church was 287 feet long. It was the second longest Augustinian church in northwest England, exceeded only by the 328 feet long church at Carlisle. Towards the end of the 14th century, the abbey acquired a giant statue of St. Christopher. 3 wills from members of the Dutton family from this period survive. They are dated 1392, 1442 and 1527, and in each will money was bequeathed to the foundation. The abbey's fortunes went into decline after the death of Richard Wyke in 1400. Wyke was succeeded by his prior, John Shrewsbury, who does not seem to have done more than keep the house in order. Frequent floods had reduced its income, and in 1429 the church and other abbey buildings were described as being ruinous. Problems continued through the rest of the 15th century, resulting in the sale of more advowsons. By 1496 the number of canons had been reduced to 9, and to 7 in 1524. In 1522 there were reports of disputes between the abbot and the prior. The abbot was accused of wasting the house's resources, nepotism, relations with women, and other matters, while the prior admitted to fornication and lapses in the observation of the rule. The prior threatened the abbot with a knife, but then left the abbey. The physical state of the buildings continued to deteriorate. The records of the priory and abbey have not survived, but the excavations and the study of other documents have produced evidence of how the monastic lands were managed. The principal source of income came from farming. This income was required not only for the building and upkeep of the property, but also for feeding the canons, their guests, and visiting pilgrims. The priory also had an obligation from its foundation to house travelers fording the Mersey. It has been estimated that nearly half of the domain lands were used for arable farming. The grain grown on priory lands was ground by a local windmill and by a watermill outside the priory lands. Excavations revealed part of a stone hand mill in the area used in the monastic kitchen. In addition to orchards and herb gardens in the moated enclosures, it is likely that beehives were maintained for the production of honey. There is evidence from bone fragments that cattle, sheep, pigs, geese and chickens were reared and consumed, but few bone fragments from deer, rabbits or hares have been discovered. Horse flesh was not eaten, although few fish bones have been discovered. It is known from documentary evidence that the canons owned a number of local fisheries. The fuel used consisted of wooden charcoal and turf from marshes over which the priory had rights of turbary. The events in 1536 surrounding the fate of the abbey and the dissolution of the monasteries are complicated, and included a dispute between Sir Piers Dutton, who was in a powerful position as the Sheriff of Cheshire, and Sir William Brereton, the Deputy Chamberlain of Chester. Dutton's estate was next to that of the abbey, and Dutton plotted to gain some of its land from the crown after the dissolution, while Brereton supported the abbot against Dutton and held the lucrative position of steward of the abbey. A campaign of vilification was directed at the canons, asserting that they were guilty of debauched conduct. then, in 1535, Dutton falsely accused the abbot and Brereton of issuing counterfeit coins. This charge was dismissed mainly because one of Dutton's witnesses was considered to be unconvincing. Playing into Dutton's hands was the gross undervaluation of the abbey's assets as reported to the Royal Commissioners of the Valor Ecclesiasticus of 1535, as a result of which the net annual income of the abbey was recorded, falsely, as falling below the £200 threshold that would subsequently be chosen for the first round of dissolutions in 1536. Although whether this subterfuge was due to the machinations of Dutton or the abbot remains unclear, Brereton and the abbot appear to have attempted to have the dissolution cancelled subject to the payment of a fine, as was the case in large numbers of other houses in similar circumstances, but in the abbot's absence dissolution commissioners arrived, unannounced, at the abbey in early October 1536. There was considerable opposition, the commissioners being menaced by around 300 local people, for whom the abbot, rushing back, threw an impromptu feast complete with roasted ox. According to Dutton's account, after barricading themselves in a tower, the commissioners managed to send a letter to Dutton, who arrived with a force of men in the middle of the night. Most of the rioters fled, but Dutton arrested the abbot and 4 of the canons, who were sent to Halton Castle and then to prison in Chester. Dutton sent a report of the events to Henry VIII, who demanded that if the abbot and canons had behaved as Dutton reported, they should be immediately executed as traitors. However, because the king's instructions had been conveyed by the Lord Chancellor in the form of letters to both Dutton and Brereton, the 2 faction leaders would be required to act together to effect them, with the consequence that Brereton was temporarily able to stall any such action by refusing to meet with Dutton. Events elsewhere in the country further delayed the execution and, following an intercession to Thomas Cromwell, the abbot and canons were discharged and awarded pensions. The abbey was made uninhabitable, a lead from the roof, the bell metal, and other valuable materials were confiscated for the king, and a building lay empty for 9 years. The estate came into the ownership of the Crown, and it was managed by Brereton. For the evidence of damage to the tiled floor of the church, Brown and Howard Davis conclude it is likely that the church was demolished at an early stage, but otherwise the archaeological evidence for this period is sparse and largely negative. Country house in 1545. The abbey and the manor of Norton were sold to Sir Richard Brooke for a little over £1,512. Brooke built a house in Tudor style, which became known as Norton Hall, using as its score the former abbot's lodgings and the west range of the monastic buildings. It is not certain which other monastic buildings remained when the abbey was bought by the Brookes. Excavations suggest that the cloisters were still present. A 17th-century sketch plan by one of the Randall home family shows that the gatehouse remained at the time, although almost all the church had been demolished. An engraving by the Buck brothers dated 1727 shows that little changed by the next century. During the Civil War the house was attacked by a force of royalists. The Brookes were the first family in North Cheshire to declare allegiance to the parliamentary side. Halton Castle was a short distance away, and was held by Earl Rivers for the royalists. In February 1643 a large force from the castle armed with cannon attacked the house, which was defended by only 80 men. Henry Brooke successfully defended the house, with only 1 man wounded, while the royalists lost 16 men including the cannoneer. They burned 2 barns and plundered Brooke's tenants, but returned home with shame and the hatred of the country. At some time between 1727 and 1757 the Tudor house was demolished and replaced by a new house in Georgian style. The house had an L-plan, the main wing facing west standing on the footprint of the Tudor house, with the south wing at right angles to it. The ground floor of the west wing retained the former vaulted undercroft of the west range of the medieval abbey, and contained the kitchens and areas for the storage of wines and beers. The first floor was the piano nobile, containing the main reception rooms. The west front was symmetrical, in 3 stories, with a double flight of stairs leading up to the main entrance. Clearance of the other surviving remnants of the monastic buildings had started, but the moated enclosures were still in existence at the time. A drawing dated 1770 shows that by then all these buildings and the moats had been cleared away, and the former fish ponds were being used for pleasure boating. Between 1757 and the early 1770s, modifications were made to the house, the main one being the addition of a north wing. According to the authors of the Buildings of England series, the architect responsible for this was James Wyatt. Also between 1757 and 1770, the Brooke family built a walled garden at a distance from the house to provide fruit, vegetables and flowers. The family also developed the woodland around the house, creating pathways, a stream glade and a rock garden. Brick-built wine bins were added to the undercroft, developing it into a wine cellar, and barrel vaulting was added to the former entrance hall to the abbey, obscuring its arcade. During the mid-18th century, Sir Richard Brooke was involved in a campaign to prevent the Bridgewater Canal from being built through his estate. The Bridgewater Canal Extension Act had been passed in 1762, and it made allowances for limited disturbance to the Norton estate. However, Sir Richard did not see the necessity for the canal and opposed its passing through his estate. In 1773 the canal was opened from Manchester to Runcorn, except for 1 mile across the estate, which meant that goods had to be unloaded and carted around it. Eventually Sir Richard capitulated, and the canal was completed throughout its length by March 1776. By 1853 a service range had been added to the south wing of the house. In 1868 the external flight of stairs was removed from the west front and a new porch entrance was added to its ground floor. The entrance featured a Norman doorway that had been moved from elsewhere in the monastery. Green believes that it probably formed the entrance for the west cloister walk into the nave of the church. An exact replica of this doorway was built and placed to the north of the Norman doorway, making a double entrance. The whole of the undercroft was radically restored, giving it a Gothic theme, adding stained glass windows and a medieval-style fireplace. The ground to the south of the house was leveled and formal gardens were established. During the 19th century the estate was again affected by transport projects. In 1804 the Runcorn to Latchford Canal was opened, replacing the Mersey and Irwell navigation. This cut off the northern part of the estate, making it only accessible by a bridge. The Grand Junction Railway was built across the estate in 1837, followed by the Warrington and Chester Railway, which opened in 1850. Both of these lines affected the southeast part of the estate. In 1894, the Runcorn to Latchford Canal was replaced by the Manchester Ship Canal, and the northern part of the estate could only be accessed by a swing bridge. The Brooke family left the house in 1921, and it was almost completely demolished in 1928. Rubble from the house was used in the foundations of a new chemical works. During the demolition, the undercroft was retained and roofed with a cap of concrete. In 1966, the current Sir Richard Brooke gave Norton Priory in trust for the benefit of the public. Excavations and Museum. In 1971, J. Patrick Green was given a contract to carry out a 6-month excavation for Runcorn Development Corporation as part of a plan to develop a park in the centre of Runcorn New Town. The site consisted of a 500-acre area of fields and woods to the north of the Bridgewater Canal. Green's initial findings led to his being employed for a further 12 years to supervise a major excavation of the site. The buildings found included the Norman doorway with its Victorian addition and 3 medieval rooms. Specialists were employed and local volunteers were recruited to assist with the excavation, while teams of supervised prisoners were used to perform some of the heavier work. The area excavated exceeded that at any European monastic site that used modern methods. The Development Corporation decided to create a museum on the site, and in 1975 Norton Priory Museum Trust was established. In 1989 Green published his book about the excavations entitled Norton Priory, The Archaeology of a Medieval Religious House. Further work has been carried out recording and analyzing the archaeological findings. In 2008 Fraser Brown and Christine Howard Davis published Norton Priory, Monastery to Museum, in which the findings are described in more detail. Howard Davis was largely responsible for the post-excavation assessment and for compiling a database for the artifacts and, with Brown, for their analysis.